Susan Smith had a troubled childhood. Her parents, Linda and Harry Vaughan, had a really crazy relationship filled with conflict, violence, and alcoholism. The tension in their home was so severe that Michael, Linda's son from a previous relationship, attempted suicide when Susan was still in preschool. Though he survived, their childhoods were forever scattered. Neighbors later described Susan as an unhappy child, often lost in her thoughts. She would stare into space like she wasn't even there, one recalled. When her parents finally divorced, Susan was devastated. Despite their toxic marriage, she had remained close to her father, but the divorce sent Harry into a downward spiral, and his depression deepened, and he drank even more heavily. One night, things took a tragic turn, and Harry forced his way into Linda's home, and their argument quickly turned violent. The fight escalated so severely that Linda had to call the police. When officers arrived, they witnessed Harry striking Linda. But instead of resisting arrest, he made a shocking request. He asked the police to take him to jail. Soon after that night, Harry took his own life. He grabbed a gun and shot himself into the stomach, ending his struggles for good. This happened just 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Shortly after Harry's death, Linda remarried. She wed Beverly Bev Russell, a wealthy businessman, and moved with her children into his home in Mount Vernon Estate, Union, South Carolina. From that point on, unfortunately, Susan's life just spiraled even further into darkness. Why? Because Bev Russell repeatedly molested her, and when she finally gathered the guts, the strength to speak out and report all this abuse, things took even a more devastating turn. Instead of supporting her, her own family turned against her. They blamed Susan for exposing the truth. Under extreme pressure from her mother, she was forced to drop the charges, and Bev Russell, unfortunately, never was punished for his crimes. And now starts our story. In 1991, a 20-year-old Susan married David Smith, a co-worker she had met while working at Winn-Dixie's supermarket. That same year, in May, they welcomed their first child, Michael. But unfortunately, again, their marriage was far from happy. Although they tried to make it work, their efforts were doomed from the start. Their relationship just crumbled, not just because of their own emotional instability, but also due to Linda's constant interference. David later revealed that during their short marriage, Linda controlled nearly every aspect of their lives, even telling them how they should raise Michael, their child. Given their situation, Susan's second pregnancy was not a joyful moment. In fact, just 3 months after their second son, Alexander, was born, they decided their marriage was over. By then, Susan had moved on to a new job at Conso Products, where she met Tom Findlay, a wealthy, well-educated man with a bachelor's degree who worked as the head of the graphic design department. For a while, Susan believed she had found something better. But once again, rejection followed. Tom eventually ended things, describing Susan as too possessive and too needy. Was that rejection the final trigger? Was it heartbreak, desperation, something far darker that led Susan Smith to drown her sons Michael and Alexander on October 25, 1994? That day, 25 of October 1994, started like any other day for Susan Smith. She got dressed for work, fed her two sons breakfast, and just dropped them off at daycare before heading to her job at Conso Product. She worked half the day before approaching her supervisor, Sandy Williams, to ask for the rest of the day off. Of course, concerned, Sandy asked, "What is wrong?" And her response was simple yet telling: "Someone I love doesn't love me back." She confided that it was Tom Findlay, the man she had been obsessed with, who had rejected her, saying their relationship will never be possible because of her children. But despite pouring her soul out, her heart out, Susan didn't leave work. Instead, she went back to her desk and kept working. At 2:30 p.m. in that day, she spoke with Tom once again. He insisted that they could still be friends, but anything romantic between them was out of the question. "It can't happen," he told her, very, very strong and firm. Desperate for a reaction, Susan made up a lie. She claimed she had been having an affair with Tom's father, hoping to provoke an answer. Very bad decision, if you ask me, but anyway, it's not me to judge here. But when she tried to take that lie back at 4:30 that same afternoon, Tom refused to talk to her. She went home that evening, describing the rejection as the saddest and loneliest in her life. Then, for reasons no one can fully explain, Susan dressed her children that night, placed them in the car, and began driving aimlessly around Union, South Carolina. At 9 p.m., everything changed. A woman named Shirley McLeod was sitting on her porch when she suddenly heard wailing coming from outside. It was Susan, hysterical, screaming for help. "A black man took my kids and my car," she was crying. Shirley's husband, Rick, immediately told their son to call 911, and this is how Susan began to deceive an entire nation and her own husband, for that matter. The case sparked a media frenzy and launched a massive search for a suspect after Smith, then 23 years old, told police that her children had been kidnapped by a black man who had carjacked her in Union, South Carolina. Her false accusation just spread quickly, fueling a nationwide effort to find the missing boys. People across the country organized gatherings, hung flyers everywhere, and simply flooded the police lines with tips, all desperately hoping to bring Michael and Alex at home. For the next 9 days, Susan made heart-wrenching pleas on national television, begging for her children to be brought home safely. "We are not going to give up until we find you," a grief-stricken David Smith told the cameras as Susan sat beside him, playing the role of the devastated mother. But behind the scenes, investigators weren't buying everything, and simply were not convinced. After multiple interviews and polygraph tests, police began to suspect Susan. One question in particular raised red flags. Do you know where your children are? Every time Susan was asked, her polygraph results came back the same. Lie, lie, lie. She took several lie detectors tests, and that question always triggered deception. She was lying. But what truly gave her away were the glaring inconsistencies in her story. She couldn't clearly explain where she had been driving that night. She mentioned stopping at a red light at the Monarch Hills intersection, yet she also claimed there were no other cars when the kidnapping happened. That last detail unraveled everything. Investigators discovered that the traffic light at Monarch Hills was permanently green unless another car triggered it to turn red. If Susan had been alone on the road, there was no way she had stopped at a red light. The lie was exposed. Eventually, the guilt probably became too much, and Susan confessed. She admitted that on that night she had strapped her sons into their car seats, drove to John D. Long Lake, and let the car sink into the water while they were still sleeping inside. During her trial, Susan insisted that she loved her children. I completely doubt. I don't buy this. But claims that the emotional weight she carried was unbearable. Really. At first, she considered ending her own life, but as she thought about her children growing up without a mother, she made a horrifying decision. If she was going to die, they had to die first. They had a father. When Susan Smith's car was pulled from the depths of a South Carolina lake in '94, the scene inside was unforgettable. The bodies of her two young sons were still strapped into their car seats, submerged in the same place where their mother had led them to drown. But that wasn't all. Also inside the car were Susan's wedding dress and her photo album, a chilling reminder of the life she once had and the one she had destroyed. Everything that symbolized Susan Smith's life was inside that car, investigators later said. Everything except for her husband, which probably she would have gladly put there if she could as well. For 9 days, that poor man stood beside her, on her side, believing her lies as she described a made-up, carjacker, and begged for her son's safe return, all while Michael, 3 years old, and Alex, just 14 months old, were already dead. Later revelations showed that the investigators had doubts about Susan Smith's story from the very beginning and strongly suspected that she had murdered her sons. By the second day of the investigation, police already believed that she knew where the children were and held onto the hope that they might still be alive. Investigators began searching nearby lakes and ponds, including John D. Long Lake, where their bodies were eventually found. However, during the initial water searches, the car was missed because the authorities had assumed that the vehicle would be within 30 feet of the shore, so they didn't extend their search further. It wasn't until later that they discovered the car had actually sunk 122 feet from the shore, far beyond where they had originally expected to find it. When the car was pulled out, and inside those two car seats were two precious boys who had been in the water for 9 days. I saw men and women in love, informants just crying. Recall Tommy Pope, the lead prosecutor in the case, who was there when the vehicle was lifted from the lake. But it wasn't just the tragedy that struck everybody. Also, it was the betrayal. The betrayal was worse than if there had actually been a carjacker, Pope said. And that's what has made this case resonate for decades. People were so drawn into help, so pulled in by Susan. The loss of Michael and Alex, along with the deep sense of deception felt by everyone who had desperately hoped for their safe return, investigators, the community, and even Susan's own family and their father, still lingers today. Smith's false accusation of a black man as a suspect wasn't just a lie. It played into a long history of racial injustice, said Gloria Brown Marshall, a civil rights attorney and law professor at the John College of Criminal Justice. How many black men were detained, beaten, arrested, accused of this crime based on nothing but her word? Brown Marshall asked. After Susan Smith's confession, her family publicly apologized to the black community. Her brother released a statement saying, "It is really disturbing to think that this would be a racial issue." The statement, reported by Washington Post in November 1994, came after days of national outrage over her false accusation. For prosecutor Tommy Pope, the thought of an innocent black man being wrongly jailed still haunts him to this day. "If that had happened, I would have quit my job," he admitted. Susan's description was so generic that if she had stuck with it and actually tried to identify someone, it's terrifying to think what could have happened. During those 9 days, when Susan repeated her lie over and over and over again, crying and appeared devastated on national television, Pope now believes one moment stood out as a chilling glimpse of the truth. She talked about the carjacker driving away while her kids were crying for her. And I remember thinking, well, that part was probably true, but not in the way Susan had claimed. She had already rolled them into the lake. And for 6 minutes, as the car floated, they were screaming for their mother. Pope shook his head. Some of the best lies are wrapped in truth. At her 1995 murder trial, which captivated the world, The prosecution pointed to reports that Susan had been having an affair with her boss' wealthy son, a man who had broken up with her because he didn't wanted children. Apparently, Susan had received a letter from Tom on 17th of October, although the tone was gentle and calm. Rejection was still very, very strong, in that letter. And one part of it said, "You will without a doubt make some lucky man a great wife, but unfortunately it won't be me." While the other part mentioned, "But like I have told you before, and yes, I am speaking, there are some things about you that aren't suited for me, and yes, I'm speaking about your children." In Tom's letter, he had also pointed out that their upbringing was very different, and that if Susan wanted to have a relationship with a good guy like him, she should act like a nice girl and should never sleep with a married man. Her defense attorney argued that she was suicidal and depressed, claiming she had originally intended to stay in the car with the children, making it a failed murder-suicide attempt. But that claim didn't hold up. Pope said to test her story, investigators recreated the sinking of the car to determine whether Susan had a chance to change her mind or save her children after rolling it into the lake. The results were devastating. The car didn't sink right away. They showed the Mazda floated for about 6 minutes before slowly disappearing beneath the surface, while cameras inside the vehicle showed water pouring in through the vents and steadily rising. The boys' bodies were found dangling upside down in their car seats, one tiny hand pressed against a window. Susan Smith made a horrific choice, said Tommy Pope. Somehow she convinced herself that if she didn't have the kids, she could be with this guy, who in reality was just brushing her off. She truly believed that, based on what he had written to her, they could have a future together. But in the end, Susan did more than take her children's life. She basically packed up, like I was saying in the start, packed up that whole part of her life and put it in the lake. As lead prosecutor Tommy Pope had sought the death penalty, believing the gravity of her crime warranted the ultimate punishment. But the jury saw it differently. They chose to sentence her to life in prison, believing that the true punishment for her wasn't death, but spending the rest of her life reflecting on what she had done. After her conviction, Susan Smith was initially incarcerated in the Administrative Segregation Unit at the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. However, in 2000, scandal just erupted when 2 correctional officers at the facility were charged for engaging in sexual relations with her. Both were sentenced to 3 months in jail. As a result, Smith was transferred to Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. From behind bars, Susan Smith had access to phone calls and text messaging, frequently communicating with journalists and men who reached out to her. What she didn't initially realize was that all these messages and phone calls could be released under South Carolina's Open Records Act. When her private conversations became public, Susan expressed frustration, saying she felt violated, especially after it was revealed that she had been juggling multiple conversations about her future with different men. You see, she had more futures, not just one. Some of these men fully knew who she was, while others were more discreet about acknowledging her crimes. One even told her that he planned to use her birthday and the birthdays of her deceased son to play the Powerball lottery. She also told one of her suitors during a phone call 1 year before her parole hearing that she could see herself around kids and that she welcomed the idea of being a mom again. How about not? The admirer replied enthusiastically, "You'd be great, babe. Wouldn't you?" Others kept the conversation light, chatting about sports, their personal lives, and making promises of a new home and a happy life once she was released. Many of the suitors are smitten by Smith and eager to talk about future plans together if she makes parole. One offered her a car, while another simply invited her to stay with their relatives. All this information, of course, according to the public phone, the phone calls that were made public. Some of Smith's relatives were unsurprised by her love life, which they described simply as messy. That's Susan. She's always had a messy love life. Some things don't change, but she seems to be happy, one of her relatives said. Smith also found herself in trouble for violating prison policies when she shared contact information for her friends, family members, and even her ex-husband. With the documentary producer, someone who had discussed paying her in exchange for her cooperation. During her time behind bars, Susan Smith received multiple disciplinary infractions, including self-mutilation, drug use, and possession of narcotics and marijuana. As a result, of course, she lost several prison privileges, further complicating her already troubled life behind bars. Under South Carolina law, at the time she was eligible for parole hearing every 2 years after serving 30 years in prison. Smith would need 2/3 of board members who are present to vote in her favor to be freed, according to the State Department of Probation, Parole and Pardon Services. She became eligible for parole on November 4, 2024, last year, just a few months ago. And Susan Smith made a tearful plea for her release. "I know that what I did was horrible," she told to the parole board, "and I would give anything if I could go back and change it." She also invoked her faith, saying, "I am a Christian, and God is a big part of my life. I know He has forgiven me, and I know that is by His grace and mercy, and I just ask you now to show that same kind of mercy as well." In September, before her hearing, her ex-husband, David Smith, had already made his point of view very clear. "I don't think she will ever be rehabilitated." Even after 3 decades, he remained convinced that Susan had never truly felt remorse for what she had done. Even to me, she's never been really sorry. David also admits that he had wished Susan had been sentenced to death rather than spending life in prison. For myself, yes, because I wouldn't have to be dealing with what's coming up now, he explained. I can't blame him. I know they said she had a tough life growing up, and I've never tried to make light of that. But you don't kill your children for what happened to you. I wanted an eye for an eye, but the jury saw it differently. Despite his anger, David revealed in September 2024 that he had forgiven Susan, but that forgiveness did not erase the pain. Yes, I have forgiven her, but that comes from my faith in God and how I was raised. We have to forgive, he said. But that doesn't take away what she did. It doesn't make it any less painful. It doesn't make it any easier. But I have forgiven her. Also, in September, David shared what he would say to Susan if given the chance 30 years after she drowned their children. I would tell her, "You have no idea how much damage you have done to so many people." And I would tell her that I will do everything in my power to make sure you stay behind the bars. Speaking to the parole board, David made one final argument: 30 years in prison is not enough. That's only 15 years per child. Her own children. This is just not enough. I'm not here to speak about what she's done in prison. I'm just here to advocate on Michael's and Alex's behalf and as their father, he said. The father said he questioned whether he could go on after Susan Smith killed their sons. What she did, not only to Michael and Alex, she came pretty close to causing me to end my life because of the grief she brought up onto me, he said. Her attorney, Tomia Thomas, did not respond to a request for comment before or after Wednesday 4 of 2024, when it was the hearing parole. He told the board his client was truly remorseful. Susan Smith's chances of parole were already slim, and according to Hayden Smith, a criminology and criminal justice professor at the University of South Carolina, research shows that one of the most influential factors in parole decisions is the presence of the victim's family. In Susan's case, that factor worked heavily against her. Her disciplinary record and the media scrutiny surrounding her case likely played a role as well, he also noted. But what sealed her fate was the fact that her ex-husband, David Smith, and 14 other witnesses attended the hearing, all opposing her release. With that level of resistance, Hayden Smith said, her chances were next to none. When victims show up and make statements, that's the central part of the process, he explained, is the dynamic that happens in the room, that relationship. The parole board really listens to that. And the public sentiment was just as strong. By the first week of November, the Office of Victim Services had received at least 360 letters, emails, and messages regarding Smith's parole hearing. Only 6 of them supported her release. The South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole and Pardon Services reports that parole is granted to violent offenders like her only about 8% of the time. According to the same Hayden Smith, violent crimes parolees also put added pressure on an already overburdened system. In Susan's case, she's been incarcerated for a long time. That often brings mental health issues, housing concerns, victim notification requirements, and a whole range of other conditions, he explained. It all ties back, he said, to the 1988 case of convicted murderer Willie Horton, who, while on conditional release from prison in Massachusetts, raped a woman and stabbed her partner. That's the Willie Horton rule, Hayden Smith said. Can you, as a parole board, give me assurances that this person is not going to hurt someone? David found love again with a woman named Tiffany, whom he married in 2003. I saw how dedicated, faithful, and compassionate Tiffany was through everything, and she stuck by my side, David said. So I knew I better make that jump before I lose it. After losing his sons, David never thought he would have more children. But eventually he and Tiffany welcomed a daughter, Savannah, and later another child, giving him a new chance of fatherhood. Thankfully, Susan Smith was denied parole in 2024, and hopefully she will never be granted freedom for the unthinkable crime she committed. Some wounds never heal, and some betrayals can never be forgiven. The only justice left is ensuring she remains behind bars, exactly where she belongs. It was very touching and moving, this case, for me, and I must say that it affected me on a much deeper and personal level than other cases, maybe especially because I struggled with infertility for so many years, and now I could leave this case being a mother, and there is no excuse. There is nothing. This is something that simply can never be done. I strongly believe her place is in jail, and I hope David Smith will have the same power over and over and over again every 2 years to go there and speak for his sons that could not have a chance or speak for themselves. So I send all my good energy and feelings and thinking to David Smith. I wish him a lot of power and a lot of happiness with his family, because he deserves that so much. And I wish him all the strength possible to be there in 2026 on 4th of November and fight for those two little angels that could not fight for themselves. I thank you for being here with me, and until next time, I hope you all will be safe. We see us in the next episode.